Hey guys, today we're going to go over the two readings you had on the Federalist and Anti-Federalists, Brutus number 1, and I believe it's Federalists 10. So these are both really important arguments as far as the federalism structure of the United States. And I'm going to do a separate video on federalism just because I'm seeing a lot of confusion on it, and I want you to have reference before you try to take the exam. Federalism is, at its most basic, trying to balance the independence of the states against the need for a stronger national government. And it's messy, and it's ugly, and it's complicated, and that's why very few countries on Earth attempt to use federalism. It's a very select group. The United States is obviously using federalism because we have our independent 50 sovereign states, and they participate in, co-managing the national government. But Germany is also a federal republic. Mexico is a federal republic. I believe Brazil is a federal republic. And that's about it. The list is pretty short. It's complicated. It's tricky to balance all those independent identities with a common need and a common identity. Brutus's big complaint with the Constitution is that he doesn't think that it can be as balanced as Madison says and still be effective. The Constitution is trying to create a stronger national government, and if we concede to certain flexing of powers by the national government through things like the Necessary and Proper Clause, those might in time grow and become too powerful to control. So that's why he says, the purpose of Brutus 1 is that, if the Constitution is bad, this is our only shot. The Articles of Confederation were a continuation of the system that the colonists knew before the Revolution happened, just without the British on top. The Constitution is a totally new system of government, and if it goes bad, it will be the last time they have a chance to do this. And so adopting the Constitution, if it's imperfect, can be very, very dangerous, and there may not be another chance to do it the right way. The first key ideas question, according to Brutus 1, which is the most desirable form of government, a confederation of states or a federal system proposed by the Constitution? Brutus says that state governments should be the primary element of government because they're closest to the people being governed. If the federal government can supersede them, then there's a strong chance that the federal government will eventually grow so large as to supersede the state's authority. And that even though the Constitution tells you there's going to be this balance between the national government and the state governments, given a long enough timeline, eventually the national government would become the superior government and the states would lose their sovereignty. He thinks the United States is too big. And keep the image in your mind of like the 13 colonies along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. That's what he's talking about. He's saying already at the time of the Constitution being drafted, the United States is too big to govern with one government. And that's why you need the state governments. He says, look, small republics of individual states can continue to exist because they're close to the people who are governing them. But large republics become tyrannical because you're further and further removed from the people who give you power to govern. And so the public interest becomes lost, and it's too difficult to keep the public in mind when you make laws. So Brutus doesn't make terrible arguments here. He loses the historical argument. The Constitution does get ratified. But these questions he's raising are questions that people continue to raise to this very day. What does the document caution against delegating power of taxation to the national government? He thinks state legislators should be the only ones that level taxes because they can be best judging what's needed. State governments have unique industries, they have unique climates, they have unique environmental and economic concerns, and so to make a tax that affects all 13 states is going to be unrealistic, and that tax is going to be overly broad and give the national government too much power to take. Whereas the states can make taxes that are specific to their needs. They know how much they need, they know how much they want to meet those needs, so they can balance their taxes more effectively. So that's his argument for the power of taxation. And last question, why does Brutus forcefully oppose the inclusion of the necessary and proper clause, his main argument is it's too vague. What's necessary and proper in Congress's mind might be the total eradication of state governments and the elimination of the states altogether. By taking that power and giving it to the federal government and allowing Congress to make laws not specifically limited by the words in the Constitution is too dangerous, and they're going to keep using more and more power regardless of the state's objections to it. And in some ways he is right. The two court cases that you look at in the federalism section, McCulloch versus Maryland upholds the necessary and proper clause and says, yes, Congress needs this flexibility to meet its constitutional goals. And even though a bank isn't in the Constitution, the creation of a bank helps them meet the constitutional goal of printing and distributing currency, which is in the text of the Constitution. But in U.S. versus Lopez, we see that after 230 odd years, Congress is using the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause as justification for really any action that they want to regulate, not just economic regulations. Where you do and do not take a firearm is being regulated as though it's a commerce transaction. And the Supreme Court finally says, hey, that's probably going too far. That's a too broad usage of what commerce is, and so that doesn't fit with how you're supposed to use the Necessary and Proper Clause. So Brutus isn't wrong, but we do have the Supreme Court there to kind of act as a way to prune back the powers as the other branches try to exert them. As far as Federalist 10 goes, Federalist 10 is trying to be a direct response to Brutus 1. Madison is literally like, I just read all the complaints in Brutus 1, now let me go through them line by line and try to calm your fears, because Madison is very much about trying to calm people down, not get them too riled up. So first and foremost, Madison talks a lot about factions. Factions are the Founding Fathers era definition of political parties. They're groups that are united by, common beliefs and impulses that work together to try to get control of government institutions and use them to promote their ideals. So we would just call those political parties today. And Madison says, these political parties, they're going to advocate for causes on behalf of their member groups, but they might not meet the definition of all people in society. So, one of the issues with political parties is they tend to focus on their members only and don't really care about other members. I think modern American politics does show that that is an issue with political parties, where they stop seeing each other as fellow Americans and start seeing each other as enemies in a political war. And that can be dangerous for democracies when they stop respecting each other's rights to govern legitimately. According to Madison, why do factions have the potential to be harmful? And like I said, they can invite unfriendly passions and violent conflicts. We see that. It's on the far extremes, but there can be actual violent outbursts. Peaceful protests devolve into unpeaceful acts of violence. Factions don't necessarily represent the best interests of the people. They represent the best interests of their faction. There are factions within the United States that don't believe in democracy, and so they want to use the institutions of democracy to gain power and then undo the institutions of democracy once they've achieved it. So that is a very dangerous faction, that can happen. That's a very dangerous action that a faction could perform. Democracies are always in a tenuous state. Our democracy has been very long lasting. The Constitution's design has allowed for ebb and flow of one political party to another. But there is always that threat there, and it's a threat predominantly caused by political parties. In fact, George Washington, in his farewell address, basically spent an entire section of his farewell speech saying, hey guys, don't form political parties. They're really dangerous, and they'll fight more for which political party can have more power rather than fighting for the benefit of the people who elected them. And, that can be a problem. So maybe we should have listened to George a little more closely. Despite the danger of factions, why do we have to let them exist? Well, they're a natural consequence of democracy. If you have a system in which people gain control of the government through voting based on certain ideals, we're going to collect into groups. It's human nature. We love tribal thinking. We do it for sports. We do it for music. We do it for movies. Why wouldn't we join together for, political ideas and associate with people who have similar opinions? So the only way to get rid of political parties would be to ban them. But that doesn't work because it's part of human nature to form them. So you could get rid of the official, political parties, but it's not going to undo how humans behave, especially in a democratic system. So, Madison says the cure is worse than the disease. If you got rid of political parties, you would also have to get rid of like free speech and freedom of association. And we know Madison holds those to be very important ideals because he wrote them into the First Amendment. So, you just have to tolerate them. You have to build a system of government with checks and balances that makes it so that the political factions are just another check. If you look at the history of how the parties win and lose elections, American government is pretty effective at keeping them pitted against each other. Barack Obama only had unified government for 2 years. From 2008 to 2010, Democrats controlled both the legislature and the presidency. Donald Trump, same situation. From 2016 to 2018, the Republican Party controlled both parts of the legislature. And then the natural ebb and flow of politics occurs, and voters tend to take away one of those branches. Last question here. How does the Republican system prevent competing factions from destabilizing nations? It's a pluralistic system. Pluralism just means there's competition of ideas going on. There's lots of groups competing for power, and that competition keeps this natural churn from happening. There's not going to be a point at which one group controls absolutely everything within the government. One last thing about the comparison between these. Madison says that, a large republic can survive because he thought that factions would always be very narrowly tailored. He could not have predicted the two large, big tent political parties we have today. He thought there would always be regional factions that dealt with specific industries or ways of life or viewpoints that were specific to the individual states. He thought maybe you'd have a faction of like New England states or a faction of southern states or a faction of states that dealt with shipping and a faction of states that dealt with farming. He just didn't see that all of that would get collected into these two massive political parties. But we'll talk more about the formation of the political parties when we get to that section of the class. Hope this helps. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, message me on Edgenuity, or send me an email, or go through Google Classroom. Have a good day.